Thank you, Keithia. I think it's probably quite nice that Keithia has introduced me, because this time last year when I was at my very first ALTF forum, Keithia presented her work, and I was so inspired, but it was altruistic, it was passionate, it was wonderful. And what had inspired me to take up my fellowship was that I was cranky. And I thought, oh, that doesn't really match up, but I've fessed up to that now. The intervening year has indicated to me that I did have just cause to be cranky, but I've now got some information around that, so it's not quite as much a gut reaction to things. Finding the balance. The caveat that goes with our presentations. What I'm going to do now is breaking all the rules of PowerPoint, and you might find this easy to watch in the screens close to you. I thought I'd just put up 20 simple statements about teacher education in Australia at the moment and why we're in the mess we are. Troubled Times was the title I gave my report. We have nationally consistent accreditation of initial teacher education. There's an increase in the number of students in education since the uncapping of entry. Along with that, there's been a significant and welcome increase in participation by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and education, the intake in 2013, 18% of all at-SIC entry went into education, which is significant. 9.5% of all university places are in education, which is a rise. Apparent doubling of numbers of courses. The AITSL, the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership, keeps a database, and it's got 438 programs in it, which seems rather excessive, but of those programs, quite a few are discontinuing. They are no longer accepting entry, so it's not quite what it seems. Moving on, the programs have our programs have the highest percentage of students with low ATAR scores. However, moving on, the GO8 has suggested that entry should be 70, but if you look sensibly at our data, the majority have scores between 60 and 80, and the highest are actually about 83 in the University of New South Wales. So the data is that what's being reported are the exceptions rather than the rule. 20% of our students have ATAR above 80, and only 27%, when you listen to all the ATAR arguments, but only 27% of our students come through the ATAR path. Reported oversupply of primary teachers, reported undersupply of secondary maths and science, new demands, new rules, new requirements for staff in early years. Oh, sorry. Losing my balance. I meant to go through this a bit faster. Apparent drop of test scores in Australian students. I probably shouldn't raise that because that's a conversation all of its own. But the NAPLAN results, which are probably a better indicator, are starting to show some improvement, particularly in regional centres. We're all talking about quality improvement. We're talking about new rigorous expectations for course completion and graduation. There's a national professional standards for teachers. We've suddenly got so much regulation in our space, it simply isn't funny, and that's what my fellowship ended up being about. We have plans for testing of education students' literacy and numeracy, and you could be in a 2-year program and be tested 4 times before you've actually graduated. Public commentary supporting graduate entry, career change. There's the Teach for Australia, Teach Next, that gets a lot of favourable attention. And we've had recently, AITSL, this group that I'll mention quite often this afternoon, looking at or being tasked with the challenge of coming up with national course entry, professional experience, and the literacy and numeracy testing. So what did I do in that environment? Well, I called it Finding the Balance. I conducted an audit of the agencies, and I used the term agency as broadly as it could possibly be. Sometimes it is authorities, authorities, government agencies and so on. I also did a case study. I ran a mentoring scheme, and I built a model. My dissemination has actually been thus far with the groups the policy drivers, the Australian Council of Deans of Education with AITSL itself, and so on. So that's been my dissemination in and around what I've done. The case study was of QUT, and I chose that because I'm an insider, participant observer. Also, we were one of the first to take on the new situation of national consistent accreditation of our course, with the addition in Queensland of extra requirements put in place by our Queensland College of Teachers, our regulatory authority. So we had lots and lots of things to do. The mentoring scheme, I went to La Trobe in Bendigo, lovely place, beautiful art collection. The Australian Catholic University, which has a really interesting faculty of education which was spread all down the eastern seaboard, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and the ACT is one faculty in 4 places. I went to the University of the Sunshine Coast because it's had a very particular profile and stamp. Because one of the things I wanted to look at was how do these institutions keep their institutional watermarks and missions in the light of national consistent accreditation. Quite a challenge. The audit. It's probably important to take a little bit of time and walk you through what this audit is, and I need to speed up a little bit. These are our agencies. TEXA, of course, you're familiar with. Associated with that, of course, is the AQF and the work of the disciplined scholars. You've also got the Open Universities Australia. While not an accrediting authority as such, you certainly need to have their approval should you wish to run courses through them. AITSL, it's the main one for us, the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership, and associated with them are the jurisdictional regulatory authorities, and there's one in each state and territory. We also have a relatively new group called ASIQA, which is legislatively the strongest of the lot of them. The Australian Children's Education and Care Quality Authority, and I'll mention them along the way. We have government, almost said interference, we have government interest in this area, it's state and federal level, and significantly with the federal level, we have a new group called CSEC. I don't know why you'd give yourself an acronym that sounds like seasick, but they have. It's the new version of Makita and Makija and all those sorts of groups that you may have a knowledge of. The schools and school systems, I mean, we're the original the original workplace learning sort of group because our students go out to practicum teaching, so we have a lot to do with schools and systems. The Australian curriculum is emerging, which is going to influence the content and our curriculum methods and the things we do, but that's become, you know, 1,000 flowers blooming because each state is doing it in their own kind of way, which is causing us some interesting dilemmas in how we're going to structure our courses. Universities themselves, looking at graduate attributes, their missions, their processes, they have their own situations to deal with. And then we've got the media, and while I've been doing this through this year in the lead up to the federal election, what the media is saying about teachers, teaching, schooling and teacher education has just been stunning and has become an agency in and of itself. Now this particular diagram, if you divide it left and right, on that side, you have the perlocutionary agencies. Well, perlocutionary means I thee wed or I sentence thee to whatever. So it's something that makes things happen, and they're the ones that can shut us down completely. You will simply cease to operate as a university, you would not be able to run your courses and so on without the approval of the ones on that side. On the other side, they're illocutionary. They've certainly got a very strong role to play, but it's more a matter of policy and guideline than you cannot proceed. And just following that line, the media just never stop talking. You can also, went the wrong way. You can also divide this north and south. So the top of this diagram, these are the agencies that affect all disciplines within a university. And for teacher education, this is looking at us as an academic discipline. And you'd all be aware of how those particular agencies impact on what happens, what the curriculum design is in your institution and your discipline. This bottom hemisphere is what we look like as a professional discipline. So we've got AITSL and ASIQA and what the government says and what the CSEC says and so on. And this was the first tension that I discovered. It was pretty easy one to find, but it was the conflict between teaching as a professional discipline and an academic discipline. So, moving on, the model. The first model I came up with was doors, because I like this idea, you know, you go through doors and you get to the next agency and you deal with what they have to say. Well, this turned out to be a fairly naive view, because I thought, well, to get to the AITSL door, I've actually got to go through my university door. But when I opened the university door, what I found was the TEXA door, and then I found the AQF door. So that was not really going to work as a model, largely because I could imagine how confusing it would be and how it would not work on a piece of A4 paper. What really scuttled this model, however, that was a dear friend of mine, says it looks like a row of dunny doors. So I think that was seriously the end of the metaphor. It was just gone at that point. I was talking about this at home, and my youngest son, who's also a teacher, said, it sounds like you're describing a London Underground, you know, how an underground map works. So that's what I started to pursue, and it kind of worked. And this is my model. This is what Teacher Education Australia looks like at this point. So I shall now sit down. No, I might have a go at explaining it. On the inside track, and I could have done this a couple of ways, but I decided this way. The central line, if you will, is AITSL, and their initial Teacher Education Program accreditation standards. And they come out in that booklet, and they have the kind of things you would imagine: outcomes, development, entrance, structure and program, and so on. So this is what we're faced with, and that's my central line. I then added the TEXA line, because they were the next most important one to me. And I started to map where what they were saying had some kind of synergy or connection with what AITSL was saying. And this is the part that an area around Standard 4, the AITSL Standard 4, that had the greatest synergy. And that synergy came through a simple little word, and that word was coherence. And that's what I was getting at with the notion of synergy. They didn't have to ask for exactly the same thing, but they just had to be sort of conceptually the same, conceptually alike. So that if you're writing a program, you knew it was in sync with what the sector itself was asking. But this notion of coherence falls apart very quickly when you have a look at the map that I ended up with. It's an issue. We then add a sequa, and there are a couple of places where it matched, particularly around the association with schools. Then I add the teacher registration boards, and they started to ask for some very specific things. And you won't be surprised to learn that New South Wales and Queensland were asking for the most things. I then added the concept of knowledge, and this seems to be going ahead all by itself, so I'll just let it do it. And I just started to build. I started to build this as things became apparent, and as I started to actually go through in quite forensic detail what each agency was actually asking for. Then I imagined what would happen when it all opened out. So you start to see the diagram beginning to grow. This is spooking me out because it was moving ahead on its own. So I'm sorry, we're filming, I shouldn't be doing speaking out loud. But that map, you had to realise that each one of those agencies didn't just affect that little circle, because I finished the diagram and thought this actually makes it look as if there's more synergy here than there actually is, because each of those agencies is also asking for other things. That was just that point of intersection. Now from that, if you recall the title, it's Synergies and Tensions. And these were my tensions, and I was quite pleased when I ended up with 10 of them, because, you know, 10 tenors, 10 tensions, it was nice. And these were things like authority, who is in charge, what's the knowledge? And I'll speak to a couple of these in a little bit more detail. What's the graduate identity? The literacy and numeracy, which probably should have been part of knowledge, has grown, largely through the media input, to be a tension in and of itself. Entry and participation is huge. Early years, as you've seen, there's a whole agency dedicated to early years. Crowded curriculum, you start to get an awful lot being asked of you. How are you going to physically fit it into your 4 years? What's expected of teacher educators became important. What does the public think of us? And there's a policy pendulum at work, particularly with the uncapping of places, things that we aren't really aware of. Let's move on. Have a little look at knowledge, because I know time is limited. If you look at the AQF, the headings or the domains are knowledge, skill and application of knowledge and skill, and most of you would be aware of that. If you line up the teacher standards, which is the de facto knowledge base for teacher education, the standards are, or the domains are, professional knowledge, professional practice, professional engagement. And it would seem that they're connected. There's this sort of line up, so you think that's going to be okay. But when you start to look a little bit deeper, you see that that's not the case at all. The problem being that what is described in the AQF levels is conceptual, it's global, it's broad brush. We can deal with that. The teacher standards, what's written for teachers in schools, is really not like that. It is very performative, it's very contextualised in the space of a classroom with the imprimatur of a school teacher to have access to student records and so on. So to my mind, the use of graduate standards or graduate standards become beginning teacher standards, and they simply belong in different worlds. It's oil and water. And this is one of the arguments I've put up in my recommendations at the end. Each of these agencies I've got here, ASEQA, two of the regulatory authorities and CSEC have also added content. They said this is the content things we need. They've added to what is the knowledge base for beginning teachers or people with an education degree. If I look briefly at graduate identity, go back to these images. One is a teacher, one is a new graduate. At which minute to midnight does one become the other? You know, it's very difficult to work out what is a graduate identity based on some of the comments in the media, and also the way that both AITSL and the AQF describe who a graduate is. Looking back to this, if we look briefly at entry and participation, we go to my underground map again, very colourful underground map, single out that particular railway junction, that's standard 3.1, which is about entry and participation, and that's where you put your shop, because it's obviously a lot of people go through that particular junction. Now I'm going to get a bit cheeky here, again not realising I was being filmed. If we take this particular very famous quote in Australian history, we'll decide who comes, we can paraphrase it to, we will decide who becomes a teacher in the circumstances in which they enrol. And then you've got to look at the word we, which is the real critical part of that, because everyone's having a say in who's going to enrol. And our incoming government has also got a set of requirements for who becomes a teacher and how they're going to be measured. And AITSL have been tasked with the responsibility of working out interviews, character tests and things of that nature to indicate who becomes a teacher. So this is what I imagine our olders and betters think a classroom in the 21st century looks like. We might just let that one sail through to the keeper. And then we wrap those tensions around it. This is the real world that I discovered when I was starting to look at just how a course is accredited. Nothing else, that's all I was looking at. I wasn't looking at the practicum placements or anything of that nature. I was looking at just how a course is accredited and what each of the agencies require of that and are asking of it. And there are ramifications for this, by the way, in some other fields. And people who've heard me speak, particularly from nursing, will come up and say, I see our future ahead in your railway map. So let's hope that this is going to scare everybody off. We can then put our railway map behind the tensions, and then of course we need to start thinking a bit more positively about, well, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to make it happen? I mean, I'd like to contemplate how on earth I got to this particular predicament. So we've got the Mencken caution about, you know, this complex, every complex problem there's a simple answer. Fortunately, it's wrong. So I offer these, I didn't even want to call them recommendations. We called them considerations. In fact, my other son suggested I call them the 7 suppositories of wisdom, but we might not pursue that, you know, the gravitas of the OLTs at stake here. And let's have a quick look at what they are. I thought first of all we needed to establish a hierarchy of the agency, basically who's in charge, you know, it gets back to that tension one authority. We've got far too many cooks, you know, there's too much oil in the, yep, 2 minutes, I'm on it. Redistribute the responsibility. What I found that looked like synergies in most cases was simply duplication. There is no need for both TEXA and AITSL to ask us what we've got in our library. There's just no need. It's just over-servicing that particular issue. Question the role of the standards in the accreditation. What I was saying is that a beginning teacher or graduate student, they're different creatures. Question the representation of teacher knowledge. I don't think it should be just performative. I think it needs to be something else. Look at our teacher educators, which I've not had time to talk to. This is one that's getting me in a bit of hot water with AITSL at the moment. I'll let that one go. And then my last consideration was to frame the future with care, which sounds a fairly obvious thing, but I thought I'd best not let it go without that being said. And that particular consideration about framing the future was based on the FDR quote that was, "The only limit to our realisation of tomorrow will be our doubts of today." And that brings me back to, like, the PISA results of this week, that we'll all be ruined, said Hanrahan. You know, we're in dire straits. Well, that might not be the case. And we might be looking at doubts that simply aren't valid enough to base a whole future on without greater responsibility. And that, my friends, is that. It's very nerve-wracking having a camera.